I used social media prolifically when I was ambassador, and I pushed the boundaries of it a bit, actually. No, a lot. I think I pushed it a lot.
Yeah.
I even trolled Russia a little bit, which is quite an interesting... Okay, so I didn't kind of go on Twitter and thought, right, how can I kind of... No, you know what I did.
So firstly, thank you so much for being with us today. And as we said, it's quite a historic week. Obviously, we're marking the 2 years of the war beginning in Ukraine. And I thought that the first thing we could do perhaps is go right back to the start of the war and your experience, and whether you could talk to us a little bit about what you went through in those first kind of few days and weeks as the war began.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me. It's good to be here. It's an extraordinary room. I've never been in this room. It's beautiful. It's quite hard to concentrate, but I'll try. Look, for me, this started in April 22, because 2021, sorry, when we first saw tanks building up on the north of the country, on the Belarus border, tanks and kit and troops. So they were coming in on the north and the east and the south, and we were all beginning to get quite alarmed about it, and we were watching it very closely, and it went on for some months. And then the Russian defense minister announced that this had been a military exercise and nothing further would happen, and they would all now be pulled back. And at that time, of course, Afghanistan happened, the US withdrew, and there was a convulsion there, and everybody's attention was moved towards that humanitarian crisis. So, but we were still in Kiev watching what was going on with all those battalions and all those tanks. And we could see that they were not being pulled back, they were being rotated, and that kit was not being returned deep into Russian territory. It was being pulled back maybe a day or two's distance. So I think that was unbelievably stressful to watch that happening without being absolutely clear where that was going. And it probably wasn't until, October, November before the invasion that this started to feel like an inexorable and quite dangerous build-up. But this is linked to COVID, because Ukraine was one of those countries whose economy had taken a massive hit because of COVID. And the government, I genuinely believe, and I know that there will be a debate to come, there already has been, about whether the government took that threat seriously enough in the run-up. But the government had to keep that economy steady, and Russia has form in saber rattling on Ukraine's borders, and indeed, of course, this wouldn't have been its first invasion. That meant that I and anybody else who from inside the country was more certain that this was leading to an invasion was a bit stuck in terms of how we could talk about it.
Yeah.
But I had duty of care for my entire embassy, so I wasn't going to tell them that this wasn't going to happen. I had to be clear about the precautionary measures it would be wise to take without being definitive about the fact that we were now staring this invasion in the face. But the truth is that, once it hit the airwaves and everybody was writing about it daily, you'd have to really be kind of locked in your room without your phone to not see this coming for yourself. Still, I think of that time, October, November, December and January before the build-up, as probably among my most stressful of periods, to be talking with other ambassadors and trying to convince them that this was something we needed to work on together, to convince them that I didn't see any off-ramps for Russia, that this was actually coming our way, and be preparing for the safety of our staff. So we triaged it. We were sending people home, British staff home. I was talking with our Ukrainian staff about ways to be safe. I stayed in Kiev for as long as I could. I only left Kiev, and only then I moved to Lviv, not out of the country, 4 days before the invasion began. I thought it was important to stick in the city for as long as I could.
Sorry, yeah, I have several questions actually of what you just said there. The first is something I've heard you talk about before, which is about the importance of COVID. And you said you felt very strongly that was a big reason why Putin decided to invade. Is that right?
I mean, I'm not inside his head.
No, of course.
Thank God. But what we do know is that Putin withdrew for the whole of COVID. He went off to his massive dacha, and he wasn't meeting anyone. And when he finally did start meeting people, he was meeting them on either ends of that improbably long table. And when you started to see essays emerge, there was one particular one where he talked about independence of the former Soviet Union countries as being special gifts. Several of my colleagues in London read that with, slack-jawed. It seemed so mad. So you have to work back, well, how do you get to that point? And I just sort of posited to myself that if you're on your own in your massive dacha palace somewhere, stewing over the fact that you'd banked on a completely inexperienced person taking up the helm of a country that you wanted to keep close to you, and he looked like he was going to be doing that, then what were your options? And we know that there are several paranoid narratives that underpin Russia's idea of its security. I just thought I saw all those coming together at that time.
And what do you do as a diplomat in those days when you were suspecting something was going to happen, worrying that a war was coming?
Well, you do what you do in any time, which is that you gather as much information as you can, you talk as much as you can. I actually went up to Chernihiv in the north of the country. I spoke to the governor there, and I also travelled as close as I could to the border. I met actually with National Border Guards. I mean, look, most of that border is completely porous, it's forest, you know, and then there's kind of Chernobyl over to the right. Unbelievably hard to stop anything coming over a border that you could barely discern. And they had quite an array, a selection of quite disparate kit. It was hard to see how you could hold something back off that border. And, you know, I would ask what they were seeing, and then I would take that back and talk to colleague ambassadors. Actually, there was a time when 7 or 8 of us ambassadors got together at my residence, and we talked about fanning out across the country to the south and the north as much as possible, and see what governors were saying about what they saw, and try to get a sense of the granularity of the threat. So gathering information was one thing, and what we also did, and what I also did in Chernihiv, was ask mayors and governors about their business continuity plans. Did they have what it would take for a fight, for an evacuation? You know, what did they have if they found themselves in the position of having to move people away? That's how I spent nearly all of my time. And then, of course, talking with government ministers about that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, so what was your relationship with the UK government during that time?
Reporting that back, of course.
Going back, yeah. And were you sort of trying to encourage them to, I don't know, help or?
So I didn't have to encourage. This is one of the most extraordinary things, really, about how the UK has been on Ukraine.
Yeah.
There was probably one seminal conversation that we had it several times, but the seminal conversation, particularly on the back of Afghanistan, and the kind of trauma that everybody who was involved in that collectively experienced, was, if Russia invades, will Ukraine fight? And it's quite important to remember, which I think is hard to remember now, that not too many people were thinking about Ukraine before this invasion. Even in spite of the annexation of Crimea and the annexation of the Donbass, it was not top of people's agenda until this began. So not a lot of people in the UK had a kind of visceral sense of Ukraine's determination for its independence, of course, as sovereign country, for its Western-leaning aspirations to join NATO and join the EU, and most of all, actually, where people were at in their minds about how far they would go to protect their country. So it was on us, really, to brief back to our colleagues in the UK that if Russia invaded, Ukraine would fight. And that I believed that they would fight well, because, of course, one of the things we did do, along with the Canadians and the Americans, several other countries, was provide military training for those troops who were on the contact line, the very long contact line down the east. They knew what they were doing now, much better and actually in a more modern way, if you like, than before the annexation. But also I briefed that Ukrainians would be prepared to fight to the death, and that if Ukrainians did do that, you would see a huge death toll, not just on the Ukrainian side, but on the Russian side too, because I did not think that that would deter Putin, and that therefore what you were looking at potentially was a catastrophe. It did not take much to land that with colleagues in the UK. Once that was landed, the clarity of UK policy flowed from it.
And on what you're saying about how Ukraine would be so strong, kind of fight on, do you think that's a unique sort of feature of Ukraine? Do you think it's because they've been almost preparing, like expecting this war to come? Or do you think that this would be maybe perhaps true of most countries?
I mean, I moved out to Kiev, and I'm sure there are lots of people here who know Kiev and have been to Ukraine, and if you go to the Maidan, then you see the pictures of the Heavenly Hundred, and there are memorials everywhere. But most of all, everybody that you know, and here of course I'm talking about a Kiev-centric perspective, but still, had a recent memory of the Maidan, had a recent memory of being shot at by Titushky from the top of the hill, and knew this was Yanukovych doing this after conversations with Putin. So right from the first day, actually, Ukrainians would tell me what they